You are watching the most valuable player in the NBA, Buffalo's Bob McAdoo. Tonight, McAdoo challenges Washington. Elvin Hayes, the Big E, has scored 60 points in the last two playoff games as the Bullets have opened up a 2-1 edge on the Braves. Randy Smith is Buffalo's Greyhound. His legs make Jack Ramsey's fast break so lethal. When Smith got into foul trouble early in the last game, the Braves' attack sputtered and finally died altogether. Phil Chenier is Washington's little girl with the curls. When he's good, he's fantastic. When he's bad, he can't put the basketball in the ocean. Last time out, he was very, very good.
You see the best in basketball when you watch the NBA. When you watch the NBA on CBS.
Welcome to the Memorial Auditorium in Buffalo and Game 4 of the Eastern Conference semifinal series between the Buffalo Braves and the Washington Bullets. Good evening, everyone. I'm Brent Musburger, along with Oscar Robertson. And Oscar, whenever we come to Buffalo, we've got to start with the big guy off the top, Bob McAdoo. What a series he's had so far.
Yes, he is, Brent. He's averaging around 35 points a game right now. And I was talking to Coach Jones before the game. He's going to try something new this game. He's going to try 4 different players on McAdoo during the ball game. Ansel, who can be very physical, the top right on your screen, if he can do the best physical job, I should say. I think Elvin Hayes could probably do the best all-round job against him as the game progresses. But tonight, he said Reardon will start on because of his speed. He can probably overplay McAdoo and probably force him in a situation like this. McAdoo drives to the basket, gets his own rebounds, test of a good basketball player that he is. Witherspoon will get a shot at him if either Ansel or Hayes gets into foul trouble.
Oscar, I've got a hunch that we are in for the best game of this series so far.
I think so. I think anytime you get to a game like this, why Coach Jones is going to start Reardon on McAdoo. He wants to save his big guys for late in the game. He wants them as fresh as possible.
Okay, yesterday, Jack Ramsey had a meeting with the Buffalo Braves. Closed doors. It lasted 35 minutes. He says his team played poorly, but they will not play poorly tonight in Game 4.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello, everyone. How are you doing? I appreciate your finding us in the vast and wild and wacky world of podcasts, and we appreciate your selecting us to entertain you, hopefully, for a little while in the vast thicket that of choices that you have out there in podcast land. My name is Tim Hanlon, and I am the chief cook and bottle washer for this little show we call Good Seats Still Available. It's our curious little journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports and teams and leagues no longer with us, or in many cases previously incarnated versions. And that's kind of the excuse that we've got this week as we dribble our way back to, finally, basketball. Obviously, the college NCAA season underway. The NBA been underway for a couple of weeks now, and it's been our issue in not sort of delving more into basketball over the last couple of weeks and months. So we're going to rectify that this week with our guest, Tim Wendel. And we're going to be talking about, as you heard alluded to by Brent Musburger and his CBS broadcast partners there, the NBA and the team known as the Buffalo Braves. That now, if you're an LA Clippers fan, you should pay special attention to, in that the origin of the Clippers, first San Diego, but before even San Diego, started in the early 1970s in Buffalo, New York, of all places, when they were known as an expansion franchise as the Buffalo Braves. And that game that you heard there as a lead-up was a playoff game, one of the very few that the Braves actually got to partake in. But circa 1975, in particular, April 18th, 1975, the Braves were locked in an early round battle with the Washington Bullets. And that game ended, by the way, the Braves winning at home 108-102 to send it to a fifth and deciding game a couple of days later, which the Bullets wound up winning. But you heard in that clip with with Brent and Oscar Robertson, the allusion to the masterful play of one Bob McAdoo, who that season, 1974-75, was the league's most valuable player. And there was a hot time going on there in Buffalo for a number of years, and we're going to get into it with our guest, Tim Wendel. He, the author of a very cool, I guess you could call it coffee table book, but it's more than that because it's not just photography. It's got some great content in there and some great memories from a number of the people and players and administrators involved with the Buffalo Braves franchise. The book is called Buffalo, Home of the Braves. You will find a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. And as you'll hear in our chat, it's basically out of print, but maybe we can get a little bit more love for this team and this book by perhaps a reissue. As we talk about with Tim in our chat. But it's a very interesting story. The NBA, of course, in the 70s was a little wobbly. You had the ABA challenge going on, certainly. You had a number of teams in the NBA that were, and the ABA for that matter, not making money. The approach to television was a little spotty. You heard a clip there from CBS, but there were a number of playoff games, for example, that were broadcast in tape delay fashion after even your late local news. It was not nearly the wall-to-wall intensity that we enjoy today as NBA basketball fans. But, in Buffalo, not necessarily the most obvious place for an NBA expansion franchise in 1970. But as you'll hear in our chat with Tim, Buffalo and the Western New York area was, in the late 60s, early 70s, was quite more populated and certainly more booming business-wise than it is sort of known as today. Yeah, the Buffalo Bills, of course, moving from the AFL and quite successfully into the NFL. And in the 1970 season, it was an interesting chain of events there that not only the Braves of the NBA were expanded with and into, but also the Buffalo Sabres of the NHL came into their league at that point as well. So, almost overnight, Buffalo was went from one major pro sports franchise in the NFL Bills to having three, and the two winter ones at that in hockey and in basketball. But basketball is what we're going to be talking about, and the Braves in particular, and some very interesting nuances. There was, some early day struggles, no doubt. A couple of years in between, in the middle there, that the Braves were quite hot with some great talent. Bob McAdoo prime among them, but Ernie DiGregorio and a whole bunch of others. Dr. Jack Ramsey, who went up to some amazing things. There's a lot of interesting players and coaches and administrators that sort of came through Buffalo. And for a little white-hot moment or two there, the Buffalo Braves were quite the thing, not only in Buffalo, but in the NBA as well. We get into sort of all of that, and of course their decline and sort of the ham-handed decline, I guess, of that team that ultimately led to a curious manner by which they ultimately became and moved to San Diego to become the Clippers. And some would even argue that, a little bit of the bad luck, I guess, as the last couple of years of the Braves kind of followed them to San Diego. The Clippers became quite the doormat for a number of years, and then obviously into LA. And, clearly on the rebound, no pun intended, with Steve Ballmer and friends now as the number 2 tenant and maybe their own arena at some point in Los Angeles as the LA version of the Clippers. But we start and go back to 1970 with the expansion Buffalo Braves of the NBA. That's our chat today with Tim Wendel in just a couple of seconds. We want to remind you that we've got a whole host of great sponsors that I believe you're actually going to find some Buffalo Braves stuff. So if you're really into this episode and this team and or Buffalo in general, I think you're going to find some very cool stuff from all of our sponsors this week. And we appreciate you giving them a chance to perhaps consider and then hopefully purchase a couple of their wares. One place you could start is 503 Sports, 503-sports.com. They call themselves the king of throwbacks, and they're relatively new onto the scene. They're based in beautiful Portland, Oregon, and you're going to find some great logo wear and T-shirts there, but also some very lovingly crafted uniforms and small sort of custom batches. especially in football, but I know they've got other things up their sleeve for other expansion into other sports and whatnot. So give them a try, give them a view, give them a visit, why don't you, at 503 Sports. That's 503-sports.com. And use the promo code SEATS to make sure you get 10% off all of your purchases there. As we've talked about in previous episodes, if you're a football fan, especially of some leagues that sort of came and went, the XFL, the first version of such, of course, the WFL, the World League of American Football, hell, the USFL for that matter. All of those leagues have some very cool limited edition handcrafted jerseys that you will amaze and impress your friends with, among other things. Check them out at 503 Sports. It's 503-sports.com. Promo code SEATS, and you're going to get 10% off your purchases there. And keep a tabs on them as they look into other sports and other teams to issue stuff. I think you're going to find them very, very interesting. I know you will find sportshistorycollectibles.com interesting because you're going to probably find a bunch of Buffalo Braves memorabilia there, as well as memorabilia from other teams and leagues no longer with us or previously incarnated. At sportshistorycollectibles.com, you can, of course, use a promo code there, Good Seats, and you're going to get 15% all of your purchases there. That's sportshistorycollectibles.com. Use that promo code Good Seats and get 15% off, things like buttons and media guides and pennants and programs and all kinds of other stuff. Lots of, season ticket brochures, all kinds of very cool, very hard to find things, and all part of the rich tableau of forgotten sports history that we like to revel in on this little show. And again, you're going to get 15% off when you use the promo code Good Seats, again, at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Last but not least, please, by all means, venture over to oldschoolshirts.com, and you're going to enjoy the highest quality T-shirts I think you're going to find in the realm of sort of forgotten sports logos and teams and names and all that kind of stuff. And it's not just sports, by the way. It's also legacy or legendary radio stations of yore, or amusement parks or malls and those kinds of things. These are all sort of pop culture type memories that you're going to find, sports, of course, included, at oldschoolshirts.com. And make sure you use the promo code there once you find, and it's just a matter of time to find one that you're going to enjoy, a shirt that you love and can't live without. Use that promo code Good Seats there at oldschoolshirts.com, and you're going to get 10% off all of your purchases there on us. And please, by all means, visit there early and often, as we like to say. Oldschoolshirts.com, promo code Good Seats for your 10% discount on all of your purchases. And again, with all of our sponsors, we not only say thank you, but we also appreciate you giving them a chance and a try. Go, point your browser over there, and for God's sakes, make a purchase or two. Why don't you keep us going? Give us a few shekels of love. And we'd appreciate that, because we've got so many great stories to share with you in the weeks and months to come. And we want to make sure we continue to be able to publish them with the high quality that we've been striving to do for the last year and a half going forward. All right, so let's move that banter promotionally to the side, and let us now move into a very fun conversation with the author of Buffalo, Home of the Braves. His name is Tim Wendel, sports writer extraordinaire. And we're going to get into it. The Buffalo Braves of the NBA, 1970s NBA basketball, coming at you. Buffalo Braves. We haven't really talked about this interesting story, and perhaps you can give our audience a bit of a sense before we get into it, how you decided to create this tome about the Buffalo Braves. Only a handful of years in the 70s. What's your story?
Well, I used to go to Tim. I used to go to Buffalo Braves games. I was in college at that point at Syracuse, and used to go back to the Buffalo area and see the Sabres and see the Braves and see the Bills, etc. And it's funny because a good friend of mine, John Murphy, who's now voice of the Bills, we would sometimes even carpool back to see Braves games. That's how much we were both into the Braves. He was maybe arcled into them even more than I was at that point in time. So I had, kind of the remembrances of them. And then to go back and do the book, Buffalo, Home of the Braves, you start peeling back the layers. And what kind of reveals itself is a number of things. The team was really, really good. It had, 3 Rookies of the Year with Bob McAdoo, Ernie DiGregorio, Adrian Dantley. You had a future Hall of Fame coach and Jack Ramsey, who will win the championship the year after he's ousted as the coach of the Braves. They're only around for about 8 years, but their style of play, everybody being able to score, very high-paced game, was really kind of a harbinger of kind of the way the league was going to become. And unfortunately, the Braves disappear. Among one of the most bizarre, I think, pretty much one franchise traded for another. The Braves are traded for the Celtics, and then I guess the new Braves go west to become the Clippers. And it was it's too bad they weren't able to stick around, because their style of play was a harbinger of things to come. And I think they would have fit in even better with the way the league was changing. In a sense, the Braves disappear roughly as Larry Bird, Magic Johnson are about ready to enter the league, and things are going to change so much in style of play, but also in terms of the respect that the league got. And that's why it's kind of a bittersweet story a little bit.
So I take it that you were a fan at a younger age and went to games. Were you there from the very beginning when they were founded in 1970, their first season in the NBA?
I don't think I was there maybe the first season, but certainly by the second and third season, I had attended some games because it was easy to do. Tickets were always available, unlike the Buffalo Sabres, where the only way we could get in is my dad ended up having to get season tickets way up in the orange balcony seats because the Sabres just kind of took off. And what was very curious about the Braves, Tim, was their first couple of years very good. What were they, 22-60, records like that. And then things changed, and they changed in a real hurry. One was the addition of Jack Ramsey coming in as coach. And I'll never forget interviewing Dr. Jack. And I tend to think the mark of a good coach is certainly somebody who's got a system, and they've got some fundamentals that they believe in and a philosophy of coaching. But I think the really good coaches that I have a lot of respect for, and, I've been sports writer now for more than 30 years, are the ones that will take their talent and what's made available to them and change accordingly. And Dr. Jack is a guy who really believes in centers, and you see the success he had, certainly with Bill Walton later on out in Portland, and Maurice Lucas, and et cetera. Made such a great front line. They didn't really have a center. And so, in a sense, they had to move Bob McAdoo, who had come into the league. The Braves outbid the ABA for him, and he was pretty much going to be a forward. But they moved him to center, and he wins the scoring championship 3 straight seasons. And I think he pretty much told me so in some of the interviews. I think if Jack Ramsey had, it could go in the direction he would want to go, or would have been with a stronger front line, maybe not playing as fast as they played, maybe not playing as much run and gun as they did. But to his credit, he saw the talent he had with McAdoo. Later on, Adrian Dantley comes in. Unfortunately, Jack Ramsey's gone by then. But the backcourt of Randy Smith, Ernie DiGregorio, Jack Marin, Gar Hurd, what a team. And so you're kind of going, we can score. Let's see if we can outscore the rest of the league. And they came very close to doing it. They often ran into the buzzsaw of the Boston Celtics. One year they were ousted by the Washington/Baltimore Bullets. And they always were in the equation. Unfortunately, they just couldn't get over, in their short existence in Buffalo, over the hump and really win a championship.
So it almost feels, though, and again, you were there, I was not, but having grown up in the New York metropolitan area and sort of a follower of the New Jersey Nets at the time, and the Knicks, of course, and the Braves would sort of waft in and out of not only town but also consciousness. It seemed, though, that they were kind of, I don't want to say ill-fated at the start, but circa 70, right? To me, there seems like 2 interesting things sort of going on here. One, It is a new franchise along with the Portland Trailblazers and the Cleveland Cavaliers in the league itself for the 70-71 season. Buffalo is. And it's two things. One, they're also launching at the same time. The NHL is dropping a team in Buffalo in the Sabres, right? So that's interesting. I'm wondering why that was that year. Was the odd wasn't new, right?
No, the odd wasn't new at all. In fact, it was coming up for refurbishing and actually raising the roof to try to squeeze more people in. It was pretty much Buffalo, in essence, trying to go major league in a hurry on a couple of fronts. And it was very exciting, in essence, to be around at that point. And, I was leaving high school, going on to college, and so very much caught up in the sports scene, and also beginning this, even starting to dabble and cover it to a certain extent. But it's funny, what you have is, and I think one of the cautionary tales the Braves are, among other things, but one of the preeminent ones that they are, is the power of good ownership and how good ownership can, cure a lot of ills. It can keep things on track when maybe a team isn't doing that well. And you almost had, in a sense, the juxtaposition of the extremes of it with the Sabres and the Braves. Sabres had solid ownership in the Knox brothers. In fact, they probably should have gotten an NHL team a couple years before, but they were passed over. They bided their time, brought in really good organizational people, and they built from there. And they had incredible drafts. I mean, for some of your hockey fans out there, the French Connection with Gilbert Perreault, René Robert, Rick Martin. You have Jim Schoenfeld on defense, Tim Horton, etc. I mean, it's just incredible how they loaded that team up. What you had, unfortunately, with the Braves is the original ownership group pretty much bailed before the team even took the court. And so they reach out to a local businessman who really was new to this whole equation. And a lot of people hold him to fault, and I don't do as much, but that's Paul Snyder, who had made his fortune in frozen foods and this type of thing. And they pretty much, the city fathers and even the NBA, reached out to him at the 11th hour and said, can you help us out? I mean, the city's been awarded a team. Now we've got no ownership group because everybody else is gone. And Snyder, to his credit, stepped up. But Snyder hadn't really, number one, prepared for this, and number two, wasn't really a sports guy anyway. Unlike, say, the Knox brothers, who had been hanging around hockey, certainly the minor league team in Buffalo at that point. I mean, they had paid their dues, so to speak. Snyder unfairly had to go 0 to 60 as an owner very quickly. And I think what you had at that point was, unfortunately, despite the best intentions, a recipe for disaster, Tim. There was very little, there was a lack of patience. And when the team starts to get better, which was still relatively quickly, but maybe not quick enough for Paul Snyder, where they make the playoffs 3 consecutive years, starting their 4th year of existence, it wasn't ever good enough. And I think sometimes if you're the key to, I think quality ownership sometimes is when you know enough about what's going on and maybe things aren't going your way, on the court or on the ice or whatever it may be, but you believe in, you believe in the system. In a sense, you're going to, we're going in this direction, we're going to stick with it. And when I first started Buffalo, home of the Braves, and I'd kind of forgotten this, even though I was at one of the games when this had happened, the Braves were destined to have a front line of Bob McAdoo, Adrian Dantley, and Moses Malone. And as McAdoo pointed out to me, he's one of the first guys they interviewed for this book, he said, you think if they kept that front line together, I think we would have done some damage. I think we would have won some titles, certainly some divisions. But because everything's a scramble and because nobody's quite sure how the game is played out, whatever's being done right now isn't good enough, Moses Malone lasted in a Buffalo Braves uniform for all of 2.5 weeks or less. And then he was peddled. Soon after that, the season after, McAdoo was peddled. Adrian Dantley wins a Rookie of the Year honor in 1977, I believe, and soon he's run out of town. All because there's a franticness among ownership. We're good, but we got to get better. We got to do something quick. Let's do something. And the revolving door with the Braves was just incredible. And if you just kind of look back at, some of the guys that they had, if they just would have hung on to them for a little bit and just kind of seen what happens, I think it would have turned out much, much better.
Well, I want to get into a couple of those things in a second, but I still can't wrap my mind around, and I'm not a native, right? So around two major league sports franchises being dropped into Buffalo. I got to think some of it had to do maybe with the frenetic pace and challenge of both the ABA and the rumblings of the WHA, perhaps. And but maybe not. But I'm also trying to figure out why Buffalo, right, versus say other markets.
At that point in time, Buffalo was.
Yeah, was it the Bills and their growth from in the old AFL coming into the NFL into their own, perhaps?
Yeah, but I think it was more that Buffalo at that point was, as recently as the mid '60s, and this is how much our country changes sometimes demographics. Buffalo, I believe, was the 10th or 11th largest media market and population base in the country, and now a media market, I believe it's in the 40s, and so. It's, you can look at it from point of view today and go, ooh, that's a small market. What are they doing with all those teams in there? But on the other hand, they had the Aud is getting renovated. At that point in time, the steel mills were still going. You still had two newspapers, etc. And I think part of it is, too, one reason we see it in all sports. I think, Tim, you would agree that, quick way to make a dime, so to speak, if you're ownership of other teams, is to let more teams in and charge them a franchise fee and go for it. And Buffalo also during this point, and people don't quite realize it, and it kind of went to Toronto instead, but Buffalo came very close to having a Major League Baseball team. And one of the things I would give Snyder credit for, and we see it now in baseball, maybe less so, maybe in other sports, but these kind of regional markets. And you had a major conundrum in a way that you had an international border between the U.S. and Canada as part of a potential regional market. But Snyder started playing 10, 15 games a season up in Toronto. I think you talk to Raptors fans now in Toronto, every now and then you talk to an old-timer and they go, yeah, I got into this game because I was watching those Braves. I was watching McAdoo. I was watching Ernie D. And in some ways, certainly Toronto's taken off in terms of population and demographics, but the seed for professional basketball was planted by the Braves playing up there. And one reason they're playing up there is Snyder's trying to, in a sense, make some money himself. He's trying to, keep things going. And it's kind of funny because I think if the Braves had stayed, and I must admit, I cringed the night the Cavaliers won. I felt, good for the good folks of Cleveland and all that. But as you pointed out, Cleveland and Portland came in the same year. And with a little bit more foresight, a little bit more patience, I really believe Buffalo could still support an NBA team, especially if they're bringing in fans if they didn't have a team in Toronto.
Well, also unmentioned, though, partially the reason, or the other part of the reason that they were playing in Toronto was the other thing I kind of want to dig into right now, which is this problem with scheduling dates at the Aud, right? It seems to me, and okay, now I'm really curious about this, right? So the Sabres and the Braves are both launched the same year in the Aud, and you'd think the two major professional leagues, right, would have, if you will, first dibs on the dates. But when it came to basketball and the Braves, that wasn't the case. Now, was it? No,
Canisius, in a sense, had dibs pretty much on a lot of the Saturday night dates, which now, from decades later, seems ludicrous. How you have a team that seems to be so small time in a way as Canisius, what are they doing having these dates locked up at the premier sports facility in downtown Buffalo? But what people don't realize is, well, this is before the Big East takes off. This is before, a lot of teams ended up in a lot of power conferences. And one of them, I wouldn't really call it a power conference, but it was a very, good arrangement for the schools in it, as you had what they called the Little Three. And that was Canisius, Niagara, and St. Bonaventure. And some people will go, that doesn't sound like much of anything. But at that point in time, this was a pretty big deal. Calvin Murphy had come out of Niagara. One of the Braves' big mistakes is not drafting him in their first draft. They went with a forward named John Hummer out of Princeton. And already, that kind of churned the waters locally. I mean, you can't take the guy who starred at our local college, but they decided he didn't have the goods to play in the NBA. But of course he did, Hall of Fame. And then St. Bonaventure too. What people don't realize is they had Bob Lanier, and if Bob Lanier doesn't hurt his knee, I'm forgetting which year here, but it's one of the years where UCLA's in the Final Four, etc. You talk to some of the old UCLA folks, and I think John Wooden even alluded to this at one point in an interview or maybe one of his books. The team they feared was St. Bonaventure, with Lanier in the post. And so it was a very vibrant basketball community. And again, I think that's something that's kind of looked over, and a lot of those fans became Braves fans, even though they lost some because they didn't draft Calvin Murphy.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you mentioned, too, it's also sort of that, either by design or by luck, right? The idea of sort of this regionalization thing. How did the Buffalo Braves fans kind of handle that, right? Because, here you are, they're our team, but then they've got all these, a sizable chunk of home games. I mean, maybe a quarter of the schedule, it seems, being played up in Toronto. I mean, I don't know. It almost feels like a second-class citizenship. But did that prevent more fans from sort of locking into the Braves, or did it maybe endear them to maybe a greater geography of them?
Tim, I think maybe it was a little bit of both. In doing Buffalo Home of the Braves, it was interesting because I talked to several Canadian fans, again, that watched the Braves at the old Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto. And again, loved the style of play. They just, wow, this is pretty incredible. I don't think it hurt, say, the walk-up gate or individual tickets that much back in Buffalo. I don't think there was that much antagonism or anger about it. It was say 10 games, whatever. It's similar a little bit to what the Bills tried to do a couple of years ago with a handful of games, and actually that was disliked even more. But I think where it really hurt was season ticket holders, because now you're kind of trying to reach out to the community, especially businesses. You're saying, hey, help, get on board. And then, the Sabres are having no problems by that point in time selling season tickets to the business community in Buffalo. Whereas my sense was it was more difficult for the Braves. Not only weren't they as successful, but as you just pointed out, well, hang on, how many games are they going to be in Toronto? Now, Toronto's not that far away. Toronto's maybe an hour and a half drive, maybe a little bit more now because the traffic's gotten worse. But so potentially for really super Braves fans, they would make the drive up. I mean, one of the things I always find ironic when I go to Sabre games back in Buffalo, when I go back home, is, especially if they play, say, the Toronto Maple Leafs, a third of the fans are Toronto fans. They come over the bridge and, come across the Peace Bridge, and they're cheering their team. And so I think the regional thing could have been handled a little bit better and made it kind of one big, community, so to speak. You're split between two countries. It potentially could have worked. But I think my sense of it is season tickets, this is where it made people more reluctant to put down the added money for a season ticket, and especially the business community, and that's, in a sense, proved to be the escape clause later on and allowed the Braves to get out of town.
Well, we're only talking about 8 seasons or so in the 70s, but in the beginning, right, the first couple of seasons, right, it seems like nobody really expected much from the Braves, which is to be expected when there's an expansion team. And I guess they didn't disappoint in that first season or two. Maybe you could describe a bit of sort of the formative years, the sort of getting, in the league and adjusted and stuff, the fans and all that kind of stuff. And it's clear that a couple of years later, things become a lot more congealed, and it's by the record and stuff. But it seems like there's some interesting bouts of futility in these first 3 seasons. No,
very, very much. And again, we're talking about expectations with the fans and this type of thing. You had futility certainly over the first 3 years, and you had some, not such, it's a typical expansion team start. It's not a very good, talent pool, except for maybe Bob Kaufman, who really endeared himself to, was a good player and endeared himself to the local populace. It was a little bit of a struggle. They're trying to figure out who's going to be the center. Elmore Smith's in. The backcourt's a bit of a mess. Things are so kind of chaotic and the door's wide open that you had a player like Randy Smith, who becomes a real fan favorite, who is coming out of Buff State, not the University of Buffalo, but Buff State College, and makes the team. And coming out of Buff State, Randy Smith was known more as a soccer player. Yet he was very fast. There wasn't a great deal of competition. He ends up winning a spot, on the fledgling Braves. But I don't know, in retrospect, if there was the patience sometimes. Things take off relatively quickly, but, the roots maybe in terms of fan following maybe weren't as deep as they could have been. And the reason I bring that up is, again, you had a community, a population that knew basketball. And that was pretty much from the Little Three. They'd had success with St. Bonaventure, Niagara, and Canisius. And in a sense, they knew good basketball. And in a sense, the first couple of years weren't good basketball. And so therefore, you don't have, in a sense, again, the season tickets and things taking off that way. It was sometimes a comedy of errors. I mean, the big blowouts, records of like 20 and 60 for the year and such. But again, that's an expansion team to be expected. But maybe the populace was expecting a little bit more, and certainly ownership was too.
Why do you think Dolph Schayes was chosen as the first coach? Because he had obviously coached, a great player, right? But had coached the 76ers for a while. I think he won Coach of the Year honors in 66 or 67, I forget. And but then I thought he was like the sort of head of officiating or something for a bunch of years. He had really not been a coach really for all that much, not only a good length of time, but then, had kind of taken a leave of it. I'm just curious as to why he was the guy circled on the blotter.
Because I think he was a name, Tim. He was a name that kind of, reverberates through, in a sense, Western New York, certainly Central New York. And I agree with you. I don't think he was maybe necessarily the right basketball mastermind at this point in time. But this is where, again, the lack of a plan or the lack of insight from ownership on down, from the front office on down, it's a little problematic. I mean, they had a good GM, but let's bring in a coach who, in essence, is more of a name as opposed to, at this point in time, a coach. And then you look again, I don't mean to compare them all the time with the Sabres, but you look at the Sabres and they've brought in a very successful coach/GM in Punch Imlach, who had great success up in Toronto. Again, that regional thing working for the Sabres' advantage at that point in time. So I think it was somewhat the fact not quite sure what to do. But I'll give them credit. They learn as quickly, but it's almost like, and I'm talking about the front office, the Braves front office, it's almost they got too accelerated or too revved up, because they did turn things around relatively quickly for an expansion team. I mean, by the fourth year, they're in there. They're going toe to toe with some of the best teams, in the game. And yet, they're making the playoffs by season 4. They're back in there at season 5, 6. But everything is too frantic at that point. It's almost like the residue or the bad memory of the first 3 seasons, especially the first 2, was resonating too much with ownership in the front office.
Well, you mentioned the arrival of Dr. Jack Ramsey, right? So it's clear that, it seems to be that he was, I don't know if he was the reason, right? But lots of good things seem to start to happen, not necessarily immediately, but relatively soon into his tenure, including not only his coaching capabilities, right? Hall of Famer he, but also a bunch of well-regarded talent, some of which we talked about, but maybe we should dig a little deeper here, right? Maybe first and foremost is Mr. McAdoo from North Carolina.
Very much. And I think, McAdoo certainly is, I guess, probably, with Dr. Jack, the main reasons things start to turn around, certainly by certainly making the playoffs by season 4. And again, I think there was, and Randy Smith's getting better at this point. Some of the supporting cast is getting better. But I don't think anybody quite expected McAdoo to be the force that he was, say, coming out of college. I mean, he played at North Carolina. He was a fine player, great player in North Carolina. But again, there was a major disagreement about where he should play. And seemed to be a natural forward, was not the biggest, he was tall, but certainly not the bulkiest guy in the world. And you got to think back, this is the time in the NBA where Wilt Chamberlain's, still going strong, even though he was still soon toning down. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is becoming a force. Dave Cowens with the Celtics, etc. And it was pretty much out of necessity. They put McAdoo at the center position, and lo and behold, he takes off. And he changed the game, I think, a little bit, Tim. The NBA is much less of a post-up game now. Get the big guy down the block, so let's feed him the ball, and he'll be like Kareem and do the sky hook, et cetera, et cetera. The Braves didn't really have that. In a sense, they had about 3, sometimes 4 forwards at a time that could all shoot, with Gar Hurd and Jack Barron, for sure. And McAdoo sometimes would step out from the paint and hit the jumper from far away. He kind of blows your mind a little bit, some of the point totals he would have put up if, in a sense, the game had caught up with him and, 3-point shot and all that type of thing. And he put up incredible numbers. I mean, I was at a game where he did, I think, 50 or 52. And again, that's been superseded and, subsequent years and such. But for a guy where you weren't quite sure what his position was going to be, and now he's putting up these type of point totals, was really pretty astounding. And it not only changed the franchise, I would argue it started to change the league. And it became much more of a fast-paced, almost running game. Who's ever open, take the shot. We're all confident you can hit the shot. As McAdoo told me at one point, Randy Smith too, he said, when we were going, 5 guys on the floor, anybody could hit that outside shot. And some of the nicknames they started to get were amazing, like the Guns of Navarone and things like that. I think the only thing I can compare it to a little bit in recent memory is it's kind of the way the Phoenix Suns played for a while when Nash was, still playing for them and things like that. There wasn't any concern about any shot clock or, slowing things down. It was like, away we go. And you had a number of fast players on it, but more importantly, you had a number of superbly offensively skilled players.
All right, time for me to catch my breath, get a cool, tasty beverage, and remind you, while we do so, that our friends at Audible are here to remind you that you can get a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and use that link, of course, to try for yourself a free audiobook on us, gratis, if you will. And you will love the idea of audiobooks. It's an awesome way to kill time and occupy and stimulate your mind, perhaps when your eyes are busy doing something else. And of course, there are plenty of interesting books to be found, especially in the world of sports and sports history. And I think our audience might enjoy a few of these, of course, including the seminal work by baseball legend Jim Bouton. It's called Ball 4. It is not only written, but it's also narrated by him. You could use your free credit for that book. And of course, as you know, Ball 4 centers around the 1969 one-year wonder that is the Seattle Pilots of Major League Baseball, but obviously the background for a whole lot of other observations about the sport of baseball. And it remains to this day perhaps one of the most celebrated writings about the sport of baseball in this country. Of course, you can also, if you're not a big baseball fan, you can go into the world of soccer with the autobiography called My Turn by Johan Cruyff, the late Johan Cruyff, perhaps one of the world's best ever soccer players. He of Dutch heritage, of course. Plenty of great legendary years at club play as well as national team play for the Dutch team, as well as, for our audience, maybe a little bit of interest, his journeys in the North American Soccer League in the late 70s and early 80s with the Washington Diplomats and the Los Angeles Aztecs. And of course, if you're into football, there's probably no better book, especially if you find yourself really interested in the sort of deep and rich history of the NFL, with the book called NFL Football, A History of America's New National Pastime. It is written by Richard Crepeau and narrated by Marlon May. That, too, is an audiobook that you could choose from over, like I said, 180,000 titles. There's got to be something in there that's going to be of interest to you. And by all means, give it a try. And we appreciate you doing so at audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you're going to get your free audiobook download. You can cancel it anytime. And again, even if you cancel it, you can keep that book as long as your device exists. So again, we appreciate it. Give it a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. And I guess, too, not to be overlooked is probably a surprise, a diamond in the rough, is Ernie DiGregorio, right? Winning NBA Rookie of the Year the season before. It's clear that there's some real talent there. And I also wonder, too, and I'm this is now a guess, only informed by our previous excursions into the old ABA, that perhaps there was a bit of a push on the NBA, right, to kind of make things a little bit more exciting, because the ABA was certainly that, right? Run and gun, fast,
right.
3-point shots, all that kind of stuff.
And you'll have, certainly, as John Y. Brown moves into ownership with the Braves, you'll have even a growing ABA factor with the Braves, for good and bad, I would say. But, the ABA was dynamic, was exciting. And, again, it was push the ball and go. And I think, and it's funny how things kind of work out serendipity a little bit. You brought up Ernie DiGregorio. I think was a great guard. I think he would have, really had a fantastic career if he hadn't hurt his knee, and if they had better ways to take care of knees at that point, as like in a sense scoping it as opposed to, straight ahead stitcher surgery type of thing. But the only way he ends up really on the Braves is he's coming out of Providence. I remember they were pretty good too. And if Marvin Barnes, they had Marvin Barnes, Kevin Stake, and Ernie DiGregorio, if they stay a little bit more healthy, I think they would have maybe even given UCLA a run for their money in a Final Four. But coming out of it, nobody was quite sure. Again, it's almost kind of the island of misfit toys. Nobody quite fits, and especially in that old prototypical NBA setup that was there in the 70s. And you had, if the gripe against McAdoo was, okay, he's got to play forward, right? He can't handle going against Kareem and those guys every night. He'll get all beat up. If that was the criticism against McAdoo, the criticism against Ernie DiGregorio was he's too short. And that seemed to be the prevailing opinion until the U.S. team plays the old Soviet Union team, I believe at Madison Square Garden, and Ernie D is the star of that game. And that raises his draft, in a sense of, the way he's going to be drafted. He goes much higher in the draft. And Buffalo is, again, looking for stars, so looking for gate attractions, and they bring him in. And it's interesting because maybe there's more better guys, maybe Doug Collins, et cetera, coming out of that era that are going to have maybe longer, more typical professional careers. But coming out of college, Ernie D was like lightning in a bottle, and you had, again, ownership looking to get people through the turnstile, so they signed him.
What was, let's talk about the stands for a second. What was your memories and or others' memories that you've learned in your research for putting this book together of going to games? Like, what was it like? I mean, how were they as well attended, let's say, as the Sabres? It seems like in the early days, maybe not so much. But I'm just wondering, like, what the vibe of a game was at the Aud. I mean, was it raucous? Was it fun? Was it nondescript? I'm what?
Well, for Tim, for big games, and now we're talking the playoff game, especially say against the Celtics. I heard later that since Red Auerbach, this was a team he kind of feared because he couldn't quite figure out how the Celtics are going to prepare for him, etc. And they had some amazing series. I mean, the Braves never won one, but several of them went down to very controversial finishes and such. And for those type of games, the Aud was rocking. And say more of a regular season game in December or January against, I don't know, somebody, Atlanta Hawks, somebody just kind of passing through. No. And the thing is, that was a major difference between the Sabres and the Braves. Almost every night, certainly after the Sabres got going, was a sellout. And you couldn't say that necessarily about the Braves. But one of the things I loved about the old Aud in Buffalo, they tore it down a couple of years ago, and I just happened to be in town when they were tearing it down and ended up going by, and it kind of brought a tear to my eye a little bit. It was a fun place to go to a game. It was small. It was a bit of a bandbox. Probably at its top capacity sat maybe 14 and change, maybe 15. And that's with people packed up in the rafters. But one of the things that surprised me in talking with, say, Bob McAdoo, Jack Marin, even Bob Kaufman, Gar Hurd, is all of them, when I was researching Buffalo, home of the Braves, almost to a man, they remembered the Aud so fondly. And some of it was the crowds. They loved it when they had a big crowd, like any athlete, things get cranked up. But Jack Marin pointed out, he said, I don't know what it was about the light there or the floor or the way things were just kind of configured, in relationship to the seats. But I love shooting there. Every shot I took at the old Aud, I felt like was going in. And you're talking, Jack Marin, the Mad Bomber, he's going to shoot a ton of shots. And that was echoed by a great many of the old Braves. They just loved, some of it was the ambiance, when it was a big game. I mean, not so much when it's dead of winter and it's only half filled. But they loved shooting there. And again, it was very difficult for them to describe a little bit, but McAdoo said at one point, he said, you can put me in there blindfolded, give me a ball, take off the blindfold, I don't care where I am on the court, I'd hit it if I was back there again. And so there's a real, familiarity, but also an extreme, almost, superstition, supernatural fondness.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can imagine what sort of that, and also, it was a relatively, you said earlier, it was a bigger market than it is now, but I do suspect that, it's just not the glamour, outpost of like a Los Angeles or New York, right?
No, not at all.
Again, it's special, right? It's also their team. It's and people can sort of alight to it a lot more easily. It's a little bit more accessible, that kind of stuff. Well, so looking at the middle part of their lives, right, 73 through 76 or so, the Jack Ramsey years, let's call them, or McAdoo years too. This is a team that was regularly in, for good 3 seasons in the playoff mix, right? They even won a round in the 75-76 season. It seems like that the team was somewhat solidified and I guess doing fairly well enough to be, near the average for ABA franchises in terms of the turnstiles. I'd imagine that it seemed like they were relatively I won't say flush, right? The NBA certainly had its problems team-wise in the league. I think in the 70s, maybe half the NBA teams weren't making money. But I think Buffalo was not among that sorry lot, though, right? I think they were doing pretty much okay.
Yeah, they were doing fine once they got into the playoffs for the, as you say, the Jack Ramsey era, and made the playoffs 3 straight times and pushed the Celtics several times to the limit, gave them all they could handle. But again, now we're kind of back to, in a sense, the problem potentially with ownership. When is good enough? And it's funny because, again, kind of comparing the two franchises going on at the same time, the Sabres are doing very well, too. I mean, you could go, both teams are making the playoffs. Come spring, you could go to a playoff game, basketball or hockey, any night of the week. That's how much both of the teams are doing well. The Sabres arguably did a little bit better. They made the final 1 year, lost to Philadelphia, lost to the Flyers, but they didn't win it all either. Yet it didn't seem to create kind of the angst or gnashing of teeth that it did over on the Braves side. Okay, you've pushed the Celtics, you've given them all they can handle. You lose kind of almost a little bit in a controversial way to the Bullets. But look at this team you have. Why don't you kind of keep it together and figure out what you've got to fill? And if anything, we're still kind of back to how frantic I think things were in the first couple of years. In a sense, I think you're absolutely right, Tim. Things had solidified, both in terms of maybe the fans, both in terms of, say, money. But unfortunately, I don't think things had solidified, in the front office. It was always, okay, what can we do now? Well, we got to do something quick. Oh, we need this, we need that. And things, as a result, started slipping through their hands. McAdoo, for example, is traded around Christmas, I believe, 76, 77, right around there. And he finds out about it. He's shopping. Toronto's back in play again. He's doing his Christmas shopping up at the Eaton Center in Toronto with Randy Smith, his good longtime friend. And this is well before cell phones and all this. He finds out when he's being paged on the Eaton Center public address system in Toronto, McAdoo, please report, or wherever. And he thinks something dastardly, something terrible's happened to his family or something. And he rushes off and then comes back, and he's got this just stunned look on his face. And Smith goes, "What's wrong?" And McAdoo goes, "I was traded to the Knicks." In a very lopsided trade. It was pretty much for money, and a couple, other folks. And there started to be a real struggle within ownership at this point because Paul Snyder has kind of lost patience. And he brings in John Y. Brown, the former owner of the Kentucky Colonels. Here's our ABA connection. And if anything, with John Y. now involved, in a sense, the roster starts changing over even more so. Part of this was both co-owners at that point, Snyder and Brown, were kind of frantic to have a championship team. Part of this may be that they had gotten close. Snyder had gotten close against the Celtics and the Bullets. Part of it may be that the Sabres are still doing really, really well. So there's a fight locally on who's going to be the big dog in town. But I think also, too, John Y. Brown knew the ABA. So he starts bringing in a great deal of folks like that. And so that's, again, where you have these very strange snapshots in time where you have, and I was at one of those games where Moses Malone is playing center that allows Bob McAdoo to move over to forward, and you're just looking at this and you're just getting fleeting glimpses of it, maybe a quarter or two, in a game because Malone has just shown up, and you're going, whoa, that's got real potential. And then Moses Malone says, he's coming off the bench, and he says, I'm better than, half these guys starting. I deserve to start. And for speaking out like that, he's traded. He's just like going, okay, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then it starts becoming a real revolving door, whether it's Ernie DiGregorio, Bob McAdoo, Moses Malone for a fleeting second, whatever. These very, recognizable names in basketball and NBA history start leaving town so quickly. And it's mostly because I think the front office.
How much do you think was pressure on Snyder to kind of, get out of town? I know that looking back, it seems like the relationship, if you could even call it that, with the Sabres was, tenuous at best. And, we kind of hinted at sort of the Canisius men's basketball situation, but we didn't talk about a guy named Father Jim Dembski, right, who seems to be, it seemed to be like a truly open and public disdain for each other. He and, between Dembski and Snyder, almost to the point of hostility. It just seems to me that Snyder had a bunch of outside forces kind of gnawing at him too, let alone his desire to do something significant with the franchise internally.
Yeah, I think that could be true, Tim. And I think deep down, I might be reading too much into it, is Paul Snyder wanted to be the owner of, in a sense, the big dog in town, so to speak. And that wasn't the Braves at that point in time. It was the Sabres, and probably continues to be the Sabres because the Braves have left. But I don't think you can underestimate kind of how John Y. Brown stirred the pot, too. Because I think the Snyder, by this point, and we're talking, 76, 77, we're kind of coming down to the end of the 8 seasons they're there. And in a sense, talking with Paul Snyder and just looking back, talking with others, I think he had lost some patience, and I think he was just wore out, from being an owner. So he kind of leaves things open to John Y. Brown, and John Y. Brown starts really picking up the pace, not only shipping players like McAdoo out and barely hanging on to Moses Malone, much more for a cup of coffee. And then we end up building the crescendo, what we're building up to. I think it's one of the most bizarre things, certainly in NBA history and maybe in professional sports, where you pretty much have John Y. Brown trading his entire team for another team, as in the Boston Celtics, and it's all jumbled up, and somehow the Celtics, even though we've got this, rosters are just pretty much being moved wholesale, the Celtics are able to hang on to the draft rights to this guy coming out of college named Larry Bird. Well, that would have been interesting if the Braves had been able to, hang on or get the rights to Larry Bird. And it's just even the people who lived through it. And one of the most notable was Randy Smith, who will go on to be the MVP soon after this whole move and, in a sense, franchise trade in the NBA All-Star game. I remember talking with Randy, and unfortunately Randy's passed on, and talking to him for Buffalo Home of the Braves, he just said it was crazy. He was getting paychecks from the Celtics, from the Braves, and kind of this new team, the Clippers. At one point, I guess I'm going west with the Clippers. And I said, hang on, you were getting at one point paychecks from all those teams? And he said, yeah. You know what I did? As soon as I got one, I ran down to the bank as quick as I could and cashed it. And that's how crazy it was. And so if the players that are involved, if their heads are spinning, you can imagine what the fans are thinking and such. But and if you look back at that franchise shift or, wholesale trade, pretty much the guy who helps pull it all together is a young attorney named David Stern, who will come, be commissioner of the NBA soon. So it kind of boggles the mind. And I really think the Braves are positioned to be one of the marquee teams of what the NBA was becoming. And I'm not talking the NBA with Magic and Bird and, the subsequent talent that's coming in, how much that changed. And you got to remember, as you well know, Tim, I can still remember the NBA finals often weren't even on live TV. You had to stay up after the 11 o'clock news.
Late at night after your late local news.
Yeah, and I told my son that one time because he looked at me like I was making stuff up. But that's how low, on the totem pole kind of the NBA was. And yet things are turning around, and yet one of the most interesting maybe talented teams in the Braves wasn't allowed to kind of reap the net benefits. And that's why, I've said before, I've written it too, that I firmly believe that the Braves are such a star-crossed team and one of the most talented teams, but the NBA and even the city of Buffalo, to a certain extent, just kind of let them slip through their fingers.
How does Brown get involved in the first place? Was this sort of his final chance, or his inevitable, or his desire to have an NBA franchise after having gone through the motions with the ABA?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, he'd gone through the motions, but really hadn't kind of stepped up to the table. And Snyder he's worn down. He's getting some, he's gotten a fair amount of criticism at times. As we discussed, he still can't get his team off on a Saturday night date in pretty much the only major arena in town. He's tried going to Toronto. He's been blasted for that. I think Snyder was just wore out. So he sold 50% of the team to John Y. Brown. But that's kind of letting, a very interesting character in and having him sit down at your dinner table, and before you knew it, it was John Y. Brown.
It also seems like, and I'm wondering sort of the John Y. Brown story is interesting for other things, and hopefully we'll get to explore that at some other juncture. But it seems like, and again, this is my investigation. You probably have a better read on it. Do you think this was calculated? We'll get into the Celtics thing in a second, but it doesn't seem like it would be given the fact that did it leak, or was it leaked, or was it specifically, told that, in June of '76, the news breaks that the Braves are basically leaving town. I can't imagine, if I've just bought 50% of a franchise, relatively, close to that publication date, that I don't want to let that news sort of either slip out or seep that out. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I don't think once John Y. Brown gets involved, I don't think he really had, let's just say, I don't think the Braves had much of a future in Buffalo at that point. Because all of a sudden you had, whether it's Hollywood, Florida, or Dallas, or whatever it may be, some of the buzz is, well, we'll move them there, we'll move them here and there. And from what I understand, what I heard from the players too is John Y. Brown really, even though he owns half the team and is really kind of controlling things to a large extent, really wasn't making his home in Buffalo that much. I mean, he'd come and join the team, and as Randy Smith said at one point, John Y. would catch up with it somewhere on the road, and suddenly be, there's a couple new players that John Y. knew from the ABA. Oh, they're part of the team now. Oh, what are they going to do? I don't know. We'll figure it out. And it really became catch what catch can. And, I think you're very astute that maybe John Y. Brown felt he kind of missed the first chance of the gold ring going around when the ABA folds, and maybe he could have done something more with the Colonels and that type of thing. This is now a second chance, and he's gotten his controls on a team. I don't think he was going to keep them in Buffalo. And so suddenly, as you say, the news started springing up all over. Well, the Braves can move here, the Braves can move there. And just think what that does to your season ticket base. What do you think that does to your fan base? All of a sudden you're going, am I going to invest in this team and they're not going to be around?
And for you completists out there, I think I juxtapose a piece of information. I think it was Snyder who had essentially looked at getting the team moved and purchased and moved into to Miami, or suburban Miami. It fell through. The city didn't like that when they got wind of it. But then, that then once that's out in the public, right, and a John Y. Brown coming in and buying 50% of the team, in some respects, all bets are off. And I think that's what really looks like it would happen the last two seasons. I mean, even if there was a promise or a renewed effort to keep the team in Buffalo, and it seems like, based on what I can tell, it was somewhat half-hearted. I got to think those last two seasons in Buffalo, for the fans, for the players, certainly for the four coaches that spun through in the 77-78 period, it was just, waiting for either the axe to fall or some definition to finally happen. But it almost felt like it was it feels to me like it was almost like a slow motion death before it was figured out as to what was going to happen with this franchise.
And I don't want to. I think it's certainly a slow motion death, but it had a couple spikes that unfortunately went the wrong way for the Braves, and their fans are looking to keep them in town. And one of them, it was in the last year, and the season's hardly begun, and they've had wholesale changes, and pretty much they've built the team around Tiny Archibald, who's come in as the guard, and they've got some big men, got Swen Nader, etc. I mean, it's kind of an interesting team, but it all evolves around Archibald and how Archibald and somewhat Randy Smith are going to be this backcourt, and they're going to, again, play fast and etc. And Archibald gets hurt, before the season really has a chance to get going. And John Y. Brown was the designer of this, this team, so to speak. And Cotton Fitzsimmons is the coach, and it seems to have some potential as a championship team. Maybe not, but it's going to be entertaining. Also, at this point in time, the Braves are doing about every type of promotion you can do. They're having Elvis night. They're having spaghetti night. They're having, any type of thing you've ever seen. Every night's like some kind of special night. But when Archibald gets hurt, and he hurts his knee and gets pretty much carried off the floor, the season was done at that point. And I think everybody knew it, from ownership down the front office, certainly to the fans. And again, now we're back to how many times around the block, how much patience does ownership have? And from what I heard from the players, it was once Archibald was hurt, John Y. Brown pretty much said, enough, in a sense, we're going to do radical things like completely trading the whole team for another team. And that became,
maybe we could sort of circle on that. So let's because that's obviously a natural sort of ending point for all of this, right? To the best of your ability, can you walk us through a little bit about how Brown essentially does this swap with the Celtics and then sets the stage for the team eventually going to San Diego and becoming the Clippers?
Right. Well, a lot of it's kind of out there in the ether at this point in time. And all I can tell you is what the players told me in putting together Buffalo home of the Braves. And that's in a sense that ownership in Buffalo, whether it's Snyder or certainly now John Y. Brown, have lost patience. And they're looking, in a sense, to do radical things. So in a sense, it was pretty much put out there, let's trade an entire team. Can we do that? Can we trade the entire team for the Braves, for the Celtics? So kind of the old Celtics kind of become the Braves. Some people get caught in the middle, like Randy Smith. And then what tops it off is you're not just kind of switching the Buffalo team with the Boston team, and they're kind of going to their respective cities now. What puts it, in a sense, the last twist is, the team that was the Braves that now became the new Celtics are going to go out west and become the Clippers. And I don't know if that could happen today. But again, we're kind of back in the Wild West days of the NBA, and maybe this is an ABA influence or something, but that's pretty much the way it shook out. And the players were, for a stretch, as much clueless as certainly the fans were. And I think it created the city of Buffalo had the opportunity, and I think they regret it to this day, to in essence take the Braves leaving to court. Not enough season tickets had been sold, and so the Braves could get out of their lease, and so therefore this franchise swap begins with the Celtics. But you still could have fought it in court. You could have really made some obstacles and made it much more difficult for, one of your professional teams to leave. And I think if anything would have happened like this today, it'd been in court, for sure. But it just seemed to, by that point, unfortunately for a good chunk of the city government in Buffalo, and maybe even some of the fan base, it was almost good riddance. And I don't think they quite realized, certainly the city government, even some of the fans realized what had been lost until maybe 4 or 5, 10 years later. And again, it takes little things like Cleveland winning the NBA championship, and you go, oh yeah, the Braves came in the same year with them, and things like that to kind of give it that nudge. And so I think the whole franchise swap really muddied the waters and just made, whether it was city fathers or maybe even regular fans, just say, okay, I've had it. I don't even know who's on this team anymore, let alone what they are anymore. And so,
yeah, I think that's interesting. This guy Irv Levin, who was the part owner of the owner of the Boston Celtics, he was a film producer. To Live and Die in L.A. in 1985. Soundtrack by Wang Chung. That's all I remember. But yeah, I mean, essentially, I guess my understanding is that he wanted to have an NBA franchise, but on the West Coast, and this was sort of the mechanism by which he and some others, and knowing John Y. Brown, was looking to kind of get out of the Buffalo situation. So it's an interesting and very, very curious one, and maybe that's a good conversation sometime for David Stern. He being sort of the young go-getter in the NBA organization that helped sort of broker this thing. But if you think about it, too, it's also a bit of, I'm sure, a little bit of, whiteboarding at the NBA offices, right, to expand further into the West Coast at the time to maybe give some more, natural geographic rivalries with, say, the Lakers or the Golden State Warriors and those kinds of, sort of expand, if you will, right? Markets and television and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to give him too much credit, but it seems like there was a bit of a thought in making that swap sort of happen. All right, so let me ask you this: what, if any, memories and/or legacy or recognition have you been able to divine from the people that you interview for this book, your memories, your just general internet trolling on a daily basis, either the Toronto Raptors with that sort of natural geographic relationship, or today's modern version of the LA Clippers? Is there any sort of acknowledgement or embrace or not of the Braves?
Not really. I think it's kind of reluctant at times, and that's what makes it kind of eerie in some ways, Tim, is that you could have this franchise, granted they only around 8 seasons, but again, 3 Rookies of the Year, MVP, Hall of Fame coach, and yet they just all, it all kind of disappeared. And I still remember talking with McAdoo, I believe he was on the Jim Rome show or something, and Jim Rome kind of started the interview with, well, that must have been really tough being in Buffalo. I guess you guys weren't very good or anything like that. And McAdoo's just looking at him like he's crazy, going, no, we were real good. We were really close to winning it all. And yet, people say McAdoo these days. I mean, we just had a thing recently about McAdoo talking to Carmelo Anthony about, Carmelo coming off the bench, Houston, and how McAdoo did it successfully for, in LA. And everybody just kind of, it's almost like McAdoo's now known as an LA Laker. Ernie D is almost known as much for his success as Providence as his success in Buffalo. It drove some of them a little crazy. Randy Smith, unfortunately, passed on a couple of years ago, but he was very proud, among others, to be a Buffalo Brave, and yet he was telling me at one point, I'm known as a Clipper now. And I was really a Brave. And so it's eerie how in this day and age, and maybe again, excuse me, it's a harbinger of things to come, how quickly a team can disappear and how quickly a real good team can disappear, and how even the good players, the great players from it, are kind of remembered in a different light because that team doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, but it kind of does, right? I mean, the Clippers have a direct lineage, right? To they were birthed, if you will, from this Braves franchise, and you could again, we kind of alluded to it earlier. I mean, the fans of Toronto today with the Raptors can owe a little bit, I think, of their franchise to, the little beginnings of interest and regionality, I guess, of what the Braves started in the 70s. And that's so, and it's, again, that's sort of another reason why we kind of do these shows, because, as these memories sort of fade and as people pass, I think it's really important to sort of remember. And this is why we also try to, bend over backwards to find, original practitioners as well, because some of these oral histories, if you will, are, important things because they can fade away in memory. And especially now with the LA Clippers, right, being this, I guess the last major NBA franchise purchase, right, for, an ungodly sum with Steve Ballmer and friends. It's interesting. I mean, you just look back to what the somewhat humble beginnings of what that franchise was. And it's interesting to go back and sort of remember how this thing came about in the first place. I mean, there's a whole generation of kids, you young whippersnappers out there, right? Think that, the LA Clippers were always in Los Angeles, and it's clearly not the case. And at some point we'll talk about the San Diego version of that. But it's all part of the history. I'm constantly fascinated, not only about sort of the existence and what transpired when these teams were around, but I'm also very interested / concerned about how today's successors or next generations of these franchises, or ones that don't exist anymore, how they are either remembered and embraced by what currently exists today, or frankly and sadly more often not. I've seen it in soccer. We've seen it in some of the football franchises of the past. We've seen it. It's almost like in some cases there's almost a willful ignorance or a desire to not be reminded of some of the times when things weren't so great. And today's NBA may not want to remember, it seems, what was going on in Buffalo back in the 70s, yet, there's some really compelling reasons as to why they should, I think. And you mentioned a whole bunch of them. Yeah,
I totally agree. I think one of the things we've tried to do, there's been some back in Buffalo, some local groups either trying to raise a banner to the Braves and, where the Sabres play now, the new arena. I'd love to see a statue, probably to Randy Smith, somewhere around downtown Buffalo. But, every now and then when I get kind of maybe discouraged about it or bummed out about how things can disappear, something will happen, just kind of give you this odd sense of hope, Tim. And I think it was a couple of years ago, the old Buffalo Braves jersey was one of the biggest sellers among, say, vintage NBA, uniforms. And I was in Buffalo, I was up there maybe a couple of years ago, and there was a guy, T-shirt shop on Elmwood Avenue, one of the main drags in Buffalo, and I'm just walking around, and I walk in, and he's got Brave shirts, and I was just, wow, I was like a god, and I got talking with him, and he said, I can't keep these in stock, and that just kind of made me feel really good in a weird way, that, even though they maybe deserved better, on a lot of fronts, the memory of Bob McAdoo, Randy Smith, Ernie DiGregorio, Dr. Jack, is still in an odd way being passed along, and that gives me some solace.
Well, Tim, I do appreciate this is a great remembrance of a team that was very essential and a big part of the NBA during the 1970s, a very interesting and transitional decade for that league. Why don't you take this opportunity to give us some promotional love? Now, this book is not in print anymore, is it? And maybe some reasons as to why, and maybe how it could become again?
Well, I think it's going to be brought back out. People can find Buffalo Home of the Braves, on Amazon, and there's different outlets that are still carrying it. And one of the things that it wasn't, actually my brother Chris was the major publisher with it, with his Sun Bear Press out of Michigan, northern Michigan. And one of the things he did very well was there's so many photographs, and there's so many, even the old the way the uniforms changed, the old player cards. He made sure all of it was in here. And it's kind of a time machine for people that are either interested in it or even knew the Braves. And it's been kind of heartening for people that have picked up the book and just start flipping through it. And I think it's got well over like 225 photographs, all this stuff. And they just go, I feel like I'm going back in time. I feel like I'm back there. And the other thing we did is one of my first jobs out of college is I worked at the morning paper in Buffalo. And there was a very esteemed sports columnist there, Phil Arnallo, who I'd read growing up and then got to work right alongside. And he ended up being a prince of a guy. That's always a disappointment when you've been kind of reading somebody and then you get to meet him. You go, I don't know. But there was no letdown on that at all. And what we've done is taken some of Phil's columns from the old Courier Express and run them, in a sense, kind of along the edges of, some of the pages. And certainly his column about the Braves leaving, the epilogue, is just amazing. It's so one of the fitting things. And, the last couple lines are John Brown's game plan was a perfect one. For 3 months, he drove everybody batty with his courting of city after city to the point where everybody had him and the Braves up to here. Then he pulled off the stupendous deal with the Celtics, and nobody as much hollered foul. Nobody cared where he went as long as he went, and they got him out of their hair. Yes, sir, Brown's game plan worked to perfection. And unfortunately it did. And I think a deserving city lost the team that they really treasured.
All right, so are we breaking news here that you may indeed figure out a way to reissue this book and a new printing?
Well, I think so. I think we will. But, folks can find it. But yes, I'd love to re-release this book. This book's near and dear to me. And I always love the cover, too. The cover's Randy Smith going up for a shot. And frankly, some days when I look at this cover, I go, that would make a great statue, probably on the corner of Maine and Chippewa or something in Buffalo. And it's deservedly so.
All right, fun times in Buffalo, New York. Certainly in the 70s it was at the Memorial Auditorium, known as the Aud. And we appreciate Tim Wendel going back into time with us to talk about the Braves in the NBA during the 1970s. And again, as time marches on, as the franchise known as the Clippers, continues to kind of move up the charts, so to speak, and sort of gain continued love from the fans, the basketball fans of Los Angeles versus, say, the Lakers and their longtime dominance. A step back or two is always interesting to know sort of how they got to what they are today. The Clippers, of course, in San Diego, but before that, the actual start of the franchise known as the Buffalo Braves. Hopefully a little cool set of information for you either as a Clippers fan or just as a fan of pro basketball and the NBA for that matter. The book, again, is called Buffalo, Home of the Braves. It's a great book. It's more coffee table like than it is written. Lots of great photography in there, a lot of good interviews, and it is published by Sun Bear Press. Came out about 10 years ago, and I do not believe it is in print, but you can find it out there. It's certainly available on Amazon. We'll have a link to it there on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up episode number 89. You will find all kinds of interesting stuff about this episode, some Buffalo Braves photography there, and of course a link to the book. And by buying the book through that link, you will be giving us some love too, and we appreciate that. That helps us keep our lights on, etc., as we strive to get more of these great episodes out to you through the magic of the interwebs. And hopefully we'll be able to maybe get some impetus behind or some rallying around maybe a reissue of this book, maybe with a couple of updates and stuff. So let's try to do that for Tim and for us. And again, by all means, go to goodseatsstillavailable.com and click on those links, any of those links, frankly, to Amazon or other places for the other media that we hint and talk about here. And we appreciate your doing so. And once you're there, and while you're there, why don't you, stay around for a little while and check out some of our other stuff. We've got an email newsletter that you can sign up for. You can click on the link and just send us an email, or if you want to do that directly, you can do that at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Of course, you'll find all of our social links there. On Facebook, there's a page devoted to us. Our spot there on Instagram, it's Good Seats Still Available. You'll find us there. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. That's our handle for that. And you will also find, a whole bunch of other sort of fun things. We love the fact that you communicate with us on social media and email. We certainly like to take your requests, whatever, by all means. And we also want to thank, of course, our friend Dr. Jerry Payne. Technically, he is a doctor. I've actually seen pictures of his certificate of authenticity, shall we say. So I'm not sure what he's qualified to actually do doctor-wise. I'm not sure that I would, get my appendix removed from Jerry. Not that he wouldn't give it a good shot, but we do know that he's got a doctorate in something, and, we're still trying to figure out exactly what that is. But when it comes to podcasting, he is the doctor of love when it comes to putting our pieces together, making us sound somewhat decent, somewhat nice, somewhat smooth. And we appreciate his efforts each and every week, despite perhaps his disdain for doing so. We appreciate him doing it. And Podfly Productions is the firm that he works with. And again, if you are interested in podcasting in any way, shape, or form, I cannot think of a better place to go to learn and or be helped by when it comes to production or editing and all that kind of stuff than Podfly Productions. You go to podfly.net, check them out, and please, of course, tell them that your pal Tim from Good Seats Still Available sent you, and they will treat you like royalty, like they do me. All right, I'm done here for this week. I appreciate your listening, and until next week, we'll talk to you again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Give it all you got, take your very best shot, and may the best team win. The time is now, the name of the game is action. They're on the floor and they're ready to score, so let the game begin.